Greetings, friends. Wanting Rizika here, and this is the weekly Russian-Ukraine war update for the week of June 24th through June 30th of 2024. And if you want to continue receiving these weekly Russian-Ukraine war updates, be sure to subscribe to my channel, give this video a thumbs up, comment your thoughts, and share this video around. So let's get into it. So this week it actually started off a little slow. I was kind of worried that I wouldn't have had much updates to give to you guys this week, but towards the end of this week, we actually got a bunch of updates all at once, so we actually have a lot of things to talk about. And first, we're going to talk about in the Toretsk direction. The Russian, as you know, last week the Russians activated in the sector, and this week, they have developed on their progress in this direction. And one thing that the reason why there's been a lot of progress in this area, and it seems like obviously in parts of the front that are very quiet, the Russians and the Ukrainians, draw, troops away from those areas towards hot points of the front. And this is why the Russian, offensive this year, which has been going on throughout the entire front line, is there's ups and downs to it. The downs of it is that, you can't concentrate your forces for a big breakthrough. You have to spread your forces out along everywhere. And you won't be able to make as much rapid gains as you would usually be able to if you concentrate your forces. The upside is that if you attack everywhere, your enemy cannot counter your big offensive push. What that means is that if the Russians were only concentrating in one or two areas, then the Ukrainians could pull troops from most of the unengaged front and bring them to that area, and then it will be a grind. This is what we kind of saw in Bakhmut, where in 2023, the first half of it, where basically all the fighting in Ukraine was happening in Bakhmut and really nowhere else. And because of that, the Ukrainians were able to draw all their reserves to Bakhmut, and it became a slow grinding attrition for months on end. However, with attacks going everywhere and with the Ukrainians not being able to replenish their troops as fast, the Ukrainians don't have the reserves to plug every hole, and this is what we're seeing in the Toretsk direction. The Russians activated in Kharkov. The Ukrainians sent almost a lot of their strategic reserves to Kharkov to hold off that, because that front was completely unengaged. But now that a new front opened, they had to hold it open. However, the Toretsk direction, which had no fighting going on since the beginning of the war, they're like, oh, well, we don't really need to support this area, so they pulled troops from it, and the Russians were able to launch an offensive here. And that's why they've been making rapid gains. And this has continued this week. The one thing about this is that, will the Ukrainians put some troops, see the breakdown happening here and pull troops to this direction? I mean, eventually they should. But, we'll have to see how far the Russians could push before the Ukrainians scramble as much troops as they can to try to put them here to stop the Russian offensive. Let's talk about what happened. So first of all, we actually got the thing about this front is that there's very few geolocated footages here, but we've got basically confirmations from pro-Ukrainian, pro-neutral, and pro-Russian sources on the Russian push here. The one place that we have had geolocated footage is this kind of water pumping station right here. We saw the Ukrainians droning Russian positions in this area. This is something the Russians took last week. And this week we basically got calls that basically everything to the east of the Sovietsky Donetsk Canal here has been taken by the Russians. The Russians took the village of Mayorska about a little over a year ago, but the Ukrainians were still able to hold positions on this edge of the canal. However, because the Russians were able to push and take this water pumping station right here, they basically kind of took out the linchpin that held the Ukrainians in this position. And since the Russians are still to the north here in Razdolovka here, the Ukrainians were kind of squeezed out and now have to retreat to the other side of the Sovietsky Donetsk-Donbass Canal into the fields here. So the Russians were able to improve their positions to the north here and have positions here. The Russians also are using this railroad as kind of a natural defense because they're using the same thing in the Soviets direction, but railroads are a good place to have defenses. They control, and as they push towards the village of Podnishnya and Druzhba, they're using this railroad as kind of like a natural defense so that Ukrainians in this position who are just pushed out from here, can't just try to counterattack, from the north here. They have a good position here. And this week, basically, what happened last week is the Russians took the fields between Panishnia and the Russian positions that started at the beginning of this war. However, this week we got confirmation that the Russian, or at least reports that the Russians have secured a foothold in the village of Panishnia, and they basically have most sources agree that the Russians have positions in these three streets right here, and the Russians have kind of like a foothold here, and they one thing I actually didn't see until as soon as I started recording this video, seems like Syriac updated his map. It seems like now it looks like the Russians have advanced along this railroad and kind of took this like intersection between that kind of divides this like town in three. This kind of is the center that connects Druzhka, northern Panishnia, and then the southern Panishnia, and taking this kind of these how would you say it, this intersection basically I think is a forward positioning so that the Russians could develop their offensive, and because the railroad, because then there's this highway, and then they probably will try to take these like residential area right here, and now the one thing the Ukrainians have is that they have another line of defense here. The Ukrainians have this kind of mountain here, some high-rise buildings here, and high-rise buildings here. So Ukrainians have a bit of a defense line right here that they can use to defend themselves. However, the Russians will probably not attack this directly, but they will probably try to do something like this. And after that, I think the Russians will continue probably trying to develop their offensive along this railroad. And then, obviously the Ukrainians have Toretsk, and with the high-rise buildings here. So they kind of have something like this. But the town of Panishnia, at least the northern part of it, will probably be cleared by the Russians. And once that happens, the Russians could probably try to take the village of Druzhba. And then the front line will, so the front line could kind of go something like this a little bit. And the Ukrainians will be able to hold the Russians off, but this will significantly, advance the Russian positions towards the outskirts of Toretsk and allow them to start clearing the fields to the south of Chasiv Yar. So another thing that we got confirmation of is that the Russians have taken the village of Shumi. This was told by us last week. However, the one thing about that is that we actually got confirmation from the Russian Ministry of Defense that this village was taken. Might be wondering why I trust them is because while the both sides, the Russian and Ukrainian ministries of defense, like over-exaggerate things, obviously. You can't take what they say at face value. Generally speaking, though, one thing the Russian MOD has done pretty well is that they are actually pretty conservative in announcing the gains by the Russians. So, for example, when you follow the war, you see like confirmation, geolocated confirmation that the Russians have taken a town. They're like, oh yeah, the Russian troops are here. And then most Russian sources say, hey, we captured this town. But it isn't until about 2 weeks later that the Russian MOD confirms that. And I think it's because they don't want to be, things are in flux. Just because the Russians entered a village, right, and it doesn't mean that Ukrainian counterattack pushed them out. And I think once the Russians hold their positions here for a certain amount of time, the Russian MOD says, oh yeah, they've finally captured it. So, they're not very quick on the gun in terms of announcing gains. So the capture of Shumi, I do give a little bit of a credibility to the Russian MOD because they are conservative, generally speaking, in terms of announcing their gains. So they announced the capture of Shumi. Now, one of the biggest gains of this week was that not only have the Russians developed on their success from last week, is that the Russians, most sources are saying the Russians developed towards the more western part of Toretsk and are now actually undermining one of the other line of defense, which is this Terrakon. This is where the Ukrainians were holding, holding off the Russians in this sector. So while the Russians broke through here, the Russians are now breaking through the other line of Ukrainian defenses in Toretsk in this area. And this week we got a bunch of updates where basically most sources are saying the Russians took all the streets on the edge of this Terrakon, and then also to the south of these high-rise buildings right here. And so they managed to take this residential area, and if that is the case, then I could see the Russians developing their offensive towards Zalishnia, trying to take the residential area here, and then from there, I could see the Russians from this point encircling the Terrakhon and forcing the Ukrainians out, and then having the front line go something like this. And then from there, the Russians could, this is very dangerous, because then the Russians could use these, continue pushing this way, and clearing these residential areas, and then now there's fields which are very dangerous to move across, but theoretically, if they manage to break through in Zalishnia, this gives them the possibility of starting to develop their offensive operations to encircle New York from the north. And it seems like that is something they're planning on doing, because this week also is not only are the Russians developing their offensives in Toretsk, they are pushing towards New York. And the title of this video is that the Russians have entered New York. Well, New York is one of the main cities in the Toretsk directions, the Toretsk-New York agglomeration, and New York is one of the major cities here. And this week, the Russians have entered New York. And what that means is that sources are saying that the Russians advanced and managed to hook a small foothold on the southern edge of New York. This is just the start. The Russians will have to hold these gains as they advance along these residential areas, and the Russians do have the possibility of clearing everything maybe to the south of here. But then once they reach the center of New York, this is where there's a bunch of high-rise buildings, and I don't think the Russians will attack directly. But the Russians can have the possibility of clearing this elongated city, and taking the residential area. But then they might stop and wait till the Russians get to the back here, if they continue developing their offensive from Zalishnia, and then try to encircle New York from two directions. We also are seeing this from the Donetsk direction, and we talked about this before, how the Russians are trying to encircle Toretsk, but they're trying to continuously advance north here, and then they might want to continue pushing towards the north here, and then connect using these two areas, and then encircle New York. That is what I think. The Russians will probably try to take Kalinova, Staromoliivka, and let's say the Russians are like somewhere here, right, at this point, and the Russians are, let's say here, and then the Russians are, let's say, just for sakes, here. Well, then, it's like, oh, suddenly, the only thing that's separating, let's use this. This is the only place the Ukrainians could retreat from, from the open fields. And so, it's, New York is in very great risk of being encircled. But New York is probably going to fall before Toretsk, but because Toretsk, the Russians have to advance more north here and advance more to the north here in order to encircle Toretsk. But the fact the Russians are making this much rapid progress in Toretsk is a very big worrying sign for the Ukrainians. So I think this is one of the main goals of the Russians for this year. Honestly, taking New York and Toretsk are huge. Taking Toretsk would be the biggest gain the Russians had, I would say, since I forgot the exact population, but I think Toretsk is about as big as Bakhmut. So this would be the biggest gain of the Russians since Bakhmut. And this is going to be a big ask. And I don't, this is not something that is finished in a month or two. Some people are saying, oh, this is the goal of the Russians for the summer. I think this is the goal at the very, very minimum, the goal of the Russians for this year. The Russians might think they could take Toretsk by January or December of this year. So, this is going to be a long, drawn-out campaign, but this might be the main axis of Russian offensive. This is where I think maybe the Russians will be focusing, because then it connects their Chasiv Yar and Selidova directions areas. Well, not really connects, but just it allows them to underpin or undermine the main Ukrainian defenses of Slavyansk to Toretsk, because this is what the main Ukrainian defense line in Donbass. So yeah, the Tourette's direction is very active, and we shall see if the Russians can continue developing their offensive here, or if it slows down to a crawl. Because we see that any offensive starts pretty with a lot of rapid gains, and then we see a slowdown in those operations. So we might, for all we know, that we see I talked about these huge big goals of the Russians in Touretsk, and the gains they've been making, which are very rapid in terms of the scale of this, the pace we would usually expect in this war. But it's almost certain that the Ukrainians will try to scramble something together, even if it means compromising other areas of the front to try to hold off the Russians here in Touretsk. So, um, this might just slow down to a crawl or something. So, I talked about all these big gains, but don't expect them all to happen. Like, oh, this is gonna happen in like a month or two. Like, no, it's gonna take a huge while. I'm just talking about kind of like what the Russians might be thinking in Touretsk. Now let's talk about where the Russians have been kind of focusing for their main offensive is in I call this the Selidova front because it's no longer about Avdiivka, but a lot of sources are saying this is the Pokrovsk front. But the Pokrovsk is so far away, it's not even like there's so much more the Russians have to take in order to reach Pokrovsk. So it's not necessarily Pokrovsk, but not necessarily Avdiivka. I call this the Selidova direction. Maybe the Donetsk direction, but the Selidova is basically this is a main Ukrainian city that is the main focal point and is the furthest, closest Ukrainian city that is helping, that is in the way of which is in the way of Russian progress. So this area, Pokrovsk is too far away to call this the Pokrovsk direction. But in any case, regardless of naming conventions, the Russians are pushing in this area. One of the main things to talk about in this direction is the final capture of Sokil. We talked about how the Russians started their offensive to enter Sokil. We talked about how last week the Russians battled for this main Sokil stronghold to the north here. And this week we got final confirmation that the village of Sokil has been completely captured by the Russians. This was confirmed by various sources, pro-Russian and pro-Ukrainian. A lot of pro-Russian sources, though, have also confirmed that the village of Yanivka here, this village right here with one street, has been taken by the Russians, which would be very significant progress. And that means basically, like, because if Yanivka has fallen, right, then that means the village of Voskog has also probably have fallen, and the Russian forward positions are probably something like this. And while we don't have confirmation that these two villages have fallen, if these two villages fall, then the northern protection of Novoselivka Pershi, which is the main Ukrainian town that holds the Russians on this bank, on the eastern bank of the Vochachka River, is going to be severely compromised. And they can't. The Ukrainians are going to. They can't. They lost Sokol. They held on to it for 2-3 weeks. It was a bloody fight, but the Russians have fully secured Sokol, and they are now, they've advanced and took another tree line here. They are now advancing, probably towards this tree line right here, and they're trying to advance and take the village of Yanivka and Voskog here. So these two villages are now, the battle for these two villages is now ongoing. The Battle of Sokol has ended, and I wouldn't be surprised if probably by mid-July or so that the Russians have fully secured themselves, in this area. And then they're going to start trying to advance towards the main goal of the Russians here, which is the Village of Progress. This is the end goal of the Russians here, at least in going westward. I think once they reach this area right here, right, then the Russians will start less focusing towards Pokrovsk, and I think they're going to start focusing more towards northwest, because all these directions was to push the Ukrainians away from Donetsk, and once they reach the Village of Progress, they'll have the Vochachka River as a natural defense, and the Ukrainians will have that, so it'll be harder for the Russians to advance across it. But once they reach here, the Ukrainians will be on this side, the Russians will be here, and then the Russians will start focusing more on the northwest here. Also, this week is not only has the village of Sokol fallen, and now the Russians are advancing towards Yanivka and Voskog. We also got confirmation from the Russian Ministry of Defense that the village of Nova Alexandrivka has been completely taken. We've known this for about 2 weeks now. but we just got confirmation of that. And this week we basically saw that the Russians are still trying to improve the flanks of this, because Nova Alexandriivka is a very elongated village, and in order to continue advancing to try to cut the Konstantinovka-Pokrovsk highway, which requires them to take this village right here, they need to secure their flanks, because if they continue advancing and take this village, their flanks will be very unsecure. And so we saw this week with the capture of this tree lines right here. So the southern part of Nova Alexandriivka has been taken. This also helps secure the gains in Sokil. And we also are seeing the Russians trying to clear they're trying to clear this tree line right here to the north of Nova Alexandriivka, because then this secures their northern sector. Where we saw Russian progress here, and right now they're saying the Russians are trying to clear this tree line, because then once they clear this and they clear the tree lines to the south, this will give them the flanking benefit in order to start assault operations towards this village right here. So the Russians are making steady progress here, and we shall see if the Russians could continue developing their success towards and finishing their things here. In the south, there's less progress. There's still some progress. We got some confirmation that the Russians are trying to clear the fields between Novoselivka-Pershi and Umanska. So the fields here are being slowly taken one by one. So the Russians are slowly choking Novoselivka-Pershi from the north. They have reached the eastern edge of it, and now they are trying to clear the south. Now, in order to get to cut off the southern part of Novoselivka-Pershi, they need to finish the battle for Razdolovka. Sources are saying the battles for Razdolovka is still ongoing. This is a very fierce fight. The Russians are bombing this area right here, trying to clear it. And basically the goal here is to kind of reach this area right here. And then from here, clear kind of this area. And then once that's secure, then they'll be able to start advancing along the Vochachka River here. And then from here, let's say they'll be able to start threatening the southern part of Novoselivka-Pershi. But in order to do that, they need to clear Yasnobrovka. But the Ukrainians are putting up a tough fight. So the Russians are storming here, but it's going to take a lot of how do you say? It's going to take the Russian. It's still a bloody fight. So we'll have to see if the Russians could continue trying to improve their positions in the south of Novoselivka-Pershi. Let's continue going to the south Donetsk direction here. In the village of Krasnogorivka, the Ukrainian position here is very precarious. I think this is one of the goals of the Russians for the summer. We talked about how the Russians are advancing in the residential area in the western part of Krasnogorivka. Most sources say that the Russians have captured everything to the south of this street right here, and they now have a foothold in this residential area. And I have no doubt that the Russians are probably continuously developing their offensive, trying to reach, the north here. So the residential area here is being cleared. But one of the more interesting parts is the reason why this main part of Krasnogorivka has not fallen yet is that the Ukrainians have two defense lines here. They have, or defense strong points. They have these high-rise buildings and this hospital. This is where the Ukrainians are held up. However, the Russians are slowly encircling here, and if these two places fall, then basically the Ukrainians will have to fall back towards this area, more towards the farms and to the outskirts of Krasnogorivka. But the main town itself would have fallen by now if the hospital and those things fall, and the Russians are facilitating that. We got sources saying the Russians are now advancing in this residential area to the east of this park in the center of it. So the Russians took something like this week and are basically getting behind these high-rise buildings. And some pro-Russian sources are saying the Russians have also cleared this residential area to the north of the hospital. So as you can see, if these two things are both true, that means that there's very little time for the Ukrainians to give up and retreat from the high-rise buildings and hospital. And if I'm a betting man or whatnot, then I would bet that by the end of July, the Russians will be able to encircle, take these hospital and high-rise buildings, and they'll be able to advance here. They'll advance here. They'll choke the Ukrainians in the park, and then by the end of July, the front line might go something like this, and the main town of Krasnogorivka will have fallen. So, Krasnogorivka, the positioning here is very precarious for the Ukrainians. Um, but what I'm interested in is how the Russians will deal with kind of this area right here. This is also part of Krasnogorivka, but it's going to probably be, the Ukrainians still have positions to hold here. They're not going to get surrounded, so it'll be a bit harder to push the Ukrainians out from like the fields here. Um, but in terms of the main center of the city itself, the Ukrainians are in a very precarious position in Krasnogorivka based on Russian gains this week. One thing we also got some more positioning on is that the Russians are developing trying to establish a firm foothold on the eastern outskirts of Maskalimanovka here, and have a bit of a foothold here. And so, I think the Russians are just trying to hold this foothold so that in the future, the Russians could continue developing their offensive into Maskalimanovka. But I don't think the Russians will continue advancing here because they still have a lot of. They still need to clear. The Ukrainians are in these fields, so if they continue advancing here, they'll be attacked on the side. This is why when the Russians captured Grigivka, that the Russians were trying to improve their positions in the flanks here because they really need to do that to secure their gains in Grigivka. So the Russians in the South Donetsk direction are improving their positions and are pushing the Ukrainians away from the South Donetsk area. In the Ugledar section, we actually have a lot of updates as well. The Russians are, after they took the village of Razdolovka, a lot of sources are saying that the fields that are between Pobeba and Razdolovka are being cleared. Sources are saying the Russians took this tree line, that they took this tree line right here, and basically the fields between Pobeba and Razdolovka are being cleared as we speak. This was expected because after the fall of Pobeba and Razdolovka, Ukrainian positions in this area became precarious, and they probably fell back towards the northern outskirts of Konstantinivka to try to defend it better and hold the Russians off from clearing the northern outskirts because they don't want Konstantinivka to be too encircled because that's what the Russians are trying to do here. They're trying to encircle Konstantinivka from the north and the south. It's basically a rerun of Novomikhailovka. But the Russians are clearing the fields very slowly, and this is so the Ukrainians aren't stopping them, but they want to slow them down at the very least. We also have, not only are the Russians clearing the fields to the north of Konstantinivka, they are clearing the fields to the south. Geolocated footage shows that the Russians have not entered, but are right on the outskirts of Konstantinivka in the south here, and are slowly but surely trying to clear the fields, these open fields between the Ugledar kind of coal mines here and the fields. But again, advancing through these fields is a very precarious, hard job. Um, so, the Russians are slowly but surely trying to encircle Konstantinivka because once Konstantinivka falls, they'll be in a better position to cut off Ugledar from the east. As we go towards more to the west here, there's been no changes in the kind of the Velika Novosulka axis. The Russians have held onto the gains in Staromayorska. The Ukrainians are doing counterattacks, but they got repelled. The Russians are still in the southern part of Urzhina. They're trying to fight into the center part, but the Ukrainians are still holding on. But no major changes on the map. There's been some changes in the Zaporozhye axis. Sources are saying we got geolocated footage of the Russians being securing the western or the eastern outskirts of Robotyne. Robotyne fell itself about a month ago or so, but the Russians are still trying to clear the flanks of it because the Ukrainians are still in this pocket here. They are still in the north here, and so it's not Robotyne is fully secured. It's very likely if the Ukrainians make counterattacks, they're able to enter Robotyne. So it's not fully secured, but the Russians want to make it secure. And again, I'm saying the Russians basically on this axis, I think, are just here to clear the Ukrainian gains of 2023 and are trying to basically reach this tree line here. And this will basically flatten the front line, reverse basically all the gains of the Ukrainian counteroffensive, and then the Russians could be very less active in this direction. and basically once they flatten the front line, they could probably stop attacking here. But if they stop attacking in Robotyda, then the Ukrainians could send their troops from Zaporozhye towards other areas. So the Russians might continue maybe small scale attacks here to try to at least pin some Ukrainian troops here. There's been no changes in the Kherson front. Let's go to the north here. Let's talk about Chasiv Yar. This is another area where I think the Russians are trying to take this summer, is Chasiv Yar. They've started this offensive in April, and the Russians have been basically battling over this high-rise district area for like most of the battle for Chasiv Yar. So it's a very big prize for the Russians, and the Russians would really like it. And it's been taking them a while, but we actually got a lot of now this map is not updated. Actually, it looks like it has been updated. It looks like they made this the gray zone, but we actually got geolocated footage of Russian troops in the canal right here, like geolocated footage of Russian troops entering here. And what most mappers have done, except for this mapper for some reason, has that everything to the north of the rail line here has been cleared by the Russians. So the front line looks something like this. Most sources are saying Kalinova has been taken, with the exceptions of probably the farmhouses to the north here. But so Kalinova has mostly been secured, and then most of the forest to the north of this high-rise district has been taken. I actually don't know how the Russians managed to push through this forest. It's a very interesting. Maybe once they cleared Kalinova, they managed to maybe advance from the north here, and then the Ukrainians had to be squeezed out. And also the Russians, as we talked about last week, some sources are saying the Russians have cleared this factory right here. And so if this is the case, then the Russians might have been able to use this rail line to kind of encircle the Ukrainian troops from the south here. And I think this kind of squeeze pushed the Ukrainians away from the forest. And now the Ukrainians are now in this forest on the other side of the Sovietsky Donetsk Canal and in this quarry right here. So this is like the main defenses of the northern part of Chasiv Yar on the other side of the Sovietsky Donetsk Canal. But for now, the taking of this forest is very good news, because now that the Russians have been struggling to secure the northern part of the Sovietsky Donetsk Canal, they've secured themselves in the south for a while now. The south has been a success, but it's the northern part that was a very big tough nut to crack. But it looks like they finally cracked it. They finally have secured Kalinova and the forest, and now the only thing that's left is the last few high-rise buildings in the micro-district. A lot of people are making fun of the battle for the micro-district, but the thing is, not like some small little thing. This is all just high-rise building areas, and the Russians have completely secured themselves in the eastern part of it and the center, and now we also have confirmation that the Russians are storming the western outskirts. So the Ukrainians were held up in these positions, and we now got geolocated footage of the Russians being in these high-rise building areas. So and we saw the Russians completely bombing the last few buildings of this. So I wouldn't be surprised that the Russians try to make one final push here to finally push the Ukrainians to this side of the Sovietsky Donetsk Canal, because they have the southern part. They have now finally cleared the northern part, and now that the flanks are secure, they can make a final push, and finally the Russians could achieve their main goal of reaching the Sovietsky Donetsk Canal, and they could then start step 2 of the Battle of Chasiv Yar. So the rest of the citadel of Chasiv Yar, the micro district, is finally getting cleared. The northern part is secure, and so but once they reach the canal, the Ukrainians will still have a little bit of a defense, because they'll have the canal as a natural defense line. But and the Russians will have to repeat what they did in the micro district with Chasiv Yar. They're going to need to clear this forest here. They're going to need to clear this quarry right here. They're going to need to clear the forests to the south here. They're going to need to clear, these villages to the south here. And not only that, they'll have to, the Russians still have a lot of they need to clear this side of the Svetski Donetsk near Klishevka. And this is why the push from Toretsk is a bit interesting because if the Russians are in the southern part of Chasiv Yar, the Ukrainians still have these positions and they'll be able to attack it from the south here. So I think if the Russians advance in Druzhba, they might start trying to wrap up and clear not only this area of the canal, but also try to maybe advance along the rail line, right? And have advance something like this and clear out this area right here, because then this secures the positions of the Russians a lot better. So the Toretsk direction might not only be in conjunction with the Donetsk offensive, but also might be in connection with the Chasiv Yar offensive. And this might be the ultimate battle. The summer offensive will focus on taking Chasiv Yar. Will focus on clearing the villages to the northwest here. But then for the winter and autumn, if those two places are secured, then Toretsk could start being encircled from two sides, and they'll be able to clear it. And then the front line might go something like this. And then from here, and not even from so like something like here, and from here they'll be able to start advancing here and start cutting the Druzhvivka Pokrovsk road. They'll be able to clear, and then from Chasiv Yar they'll be able to have the high ground advantage and start basically just the Russians will advance from here and from here, and they'll be able to do what they did in Toretsk to Konstantinovka. They'll be able to do what they did there to Druzhvivka, and basically, cut this entire area. And from here, this will be part 2. The Russians will then be too far extended to do the same thing in Slavyansk and Kramatorsk to encircle it from the south and north. But the Russians might improve their defenses and start probably the battle for Pokrovsk, and then the battle for Slavyansk and Kramatorsk which would be the final battle. Because then once Pokrovsk is fully taken, then they could improve their flanking positions in the south part of Donetsk, and they'll be able to continue pushing and cutting off Kramatorsk and Slavyansk from the south. This might be also in conjunction if the Russians do an offensive in the Liman direction and reach the Oskil River, and then they'll be able to just also attack from the south here, like they did in 2022, to hasten the fall of Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. So, all this to say is that these are big gains. This is not going to happen this summer, this year even. But this is definitely something. I think the Russian goal is to take Donbass by the end of 2025. And that is, depending on the rate of attrition, that is a doable goal. But we shall see how the Russians continue developing their offensive. But the capture of Donbass is their main goal. And they could probably take it by the end of 2025 if they continue, and that is more likely than not. Obviously, I can't read their plans. I don't know. Things on the ground might change the calculus of what they might do. So this is not what I say will happen. I'm just saying that based on what I'm seeing, this is a likely course of action for the Russians to try to take Donbass. In the Seversk direction, we actually have a lot of updates. The main thing is that the Russians have fully captured the village of Razdolovka. This is where the only gains we got before later this week have gone. We got confirmation from the Russian Ministry of Defense that the village of Razdolovka has been taken. This is a good first step, but this just basically helps secure the more. This basically was facilitated because of the small Russian gains that have been going on for the last few months along this rail line towards Vimka. And this basically allowed the Russians to finally take Razdolovka because they were able to clear the fields to the east here. So Razdolovka has fallen. It's a good prize for the Russians in the Seversk direction. And I am interested to see how the Russians will develop in the Seversk direction. One thing we actually got confirmation of this today actually was from the Russian MODs that the village of Spornia has been taken. Now Spornia is a village, but it is no longer a village. I say this because it's been wiped off the face of the fucking earth. There's nothing there anymore. But the Russians have been very heavily bombing this, and I wouldn't be surprised if they did try to push the Ukrainians out of here. The thing is, the Russians have captured this before, but then they got pushed out. So it's a big if to know if the Russians actually could hold on to Spornia. But basically, it's good to mention that the Russians are saying they took it, and again, slowly but surely, the Russians are putting pressure in Seversk, and the Ukrainians can't pull troops from this direction to other areas. So in Seversk, the Russians are now on the offensive. One thing where the Ukrainians are actually on the offensive is on the Liman front. This is actually where the Ukrainians have a little bit of an initiative here. One thing we got confirmation of this week is that the eastern fields of Terni have been cleared. Sources are saying basically that this area right here and these areas right here have been cleared by the Ukrainians. This makes sense because, as you remember, the Russians were trying to take Terni last spring, but they never managed to actually take the village. And so, the supply of these fields, there's no roads here. There's no roads supplying, the fields here. There's a big chasm between Kremenaya and Terni, in this area, so there's like this highway, but then there's like nothing. There's like one road here, and then there's like just a bunch of fields, so it's very, very hard for the Russians to support forward positions. And so, since the Ukrainians have, connections here, they're able to. The Russians, since they weren't able to supply it as well and weren't able to secure their gains here, the Ukrainians were able to push the Russians away from Terni and back towards more or less the positions they had before they went on their offensive. So the battle for Terni ended in Russian failure, and the Ukrainians were able to hold their positions in this area. The Ukrainians are also on the offensive, not on the offensive, but are also improving their positions in the Severbrandsky forest. Sources are saying that the Ukrainians have cleared some parts of the forest here, and are basically trying to improve the positions in the north from Bilogorivka, because the Russians are pushing Bilogorivka, are slowly taking positions here, and they don't want the northern part of Seversk to be compromised. And in order to not compromise it, they want to secure the forest a bit better. So the Ukrainians are improving their positions in the forest. They're improving their positions in Terni. Nothing too compromising yet, but it is something worth mentioning. In the Kupiansk front, there's actually been some changes here. We actually have confirmation. The battle for Slimakhovka has started. We talked about how the Russians took these two villages here, and now the Russians have started the offensive operations to take Slimakhovka. We actually got confirmation that the Russians have entered the southern part of Slimakhovka here. And not only that, we actually got geolocated footage today of the Russians using a big armored offensive and dropping off troops on the eastern outskirts of Slimakhovka, about here. So if that is the case, then the battle for Slimakhovka has started this week, and I am, probably within a week or two, it will probably be finished, and the Russians will fully take Slimakhovka and continuously take back the lands of the Luhansk Oblast. So the battle for Slimakhovka is continuing, and we shall see if they're able to complete it this week. We also got some confirmation the Russians have activated in the northern part of the Kupiansk direction. Usually they've been focused on more of the southern part of it. However, in the northern part, we got confirmation that the Russians did some various assaults here, and we got geolocated footage of the Russians clearing Ukrainian strongholds in the fields between Vyshana and Petropavlovka. And, so we got some geolocated footage of Russian troops here. They've been trying to storm these fields here, and not only does this get the Russians closer to Petropavlovka, this also threatens the eastern outskirts of Sinkovka, and Sinkovka is the main stronghold the Ukrainians are using to defend the northern part of Kupiansk. And Sinkovka has been a pain in the ass for the Russians, and it is a very hard time to crack it. But I think the Russians have activated here. They are slowly trying to clear the fields here, but again, it's a tall order. Attacking the field is always a pain in the ass in this war. But the Russians have activated here, and we shall see if they could make life in Sinkovka a bit harder for the Ukrainians. Let's now go to the Kharkov front. In the Lipsy front, there's actually not been a lot of changes this week. The Ukrainians are still trying to take the village of Globoka, but they have not succeeded yet. They have not furthered their progress. They are still further progress from last week. They have pushed the Russians away from Lipsy, but they have not done their objective of taking back Globoka just yet. The more actually interesting part of this week is actually in the town of Vachansk. This week we actually have a lot of updates. The first thing is that the Russians are storming what they call the Vachansk Citadel. This is the main Ukrainian defenses in the north of Vachansk, and holding this is what if the Ukrainians could hold this center of the town, then the northern Vachansk could hold. However, if it falls, then the Ukrainians, there's nothing stopping the Russians from fully securing the northern part of Vachansk. And that might just be enough. The Russians might be like, okay, fuck it, we're not going to take the southern part of Vachansk, but we want to at least have positions in the northern part here. But we got some geolocated footage of the Russians storming some of these high-rise buildings right here. We got some Russians storming this high-rise building. We got footage of Ukrainian drones droning these high-rise buildings. So it's a bit of the Russians are storming the Vachansk Citadel, the main holdout for the Ukrainians here. We got confirmation that the Russians are mostly in control of the aggregate plant right here. And not only that, we were talking about how the Russians are in this plant, but maybe they're cut off from like the Russians in the Vachansk. However, we got geolocated footage of Russian troops being on this area right here. And so, with this confirmation, we basically we know that the Russians in the aggregate factory of Vachansk have a supply connection to the main Russian defenses here, and not only that, this also threatens the southern part of the high-rise buildings of Vachansk, because if the Russians are here in the aggregate plant and have complete control of this area, then the Ukrainians in the high-rise buildings are going to be in a very tough spot. However, the Ukrainians are everywhere in the center. The Russians have some gains, but the Ukrainians are improving their positions in the everywhere in the flanks of Vachansk. The Ukrainians have there's been geolocated footage of Ukrainians in the northern part of the residential area here, and they have secured themselves in this residential area here, and so they've been clearing and trying to clear these streets right here. We also got some geolocated footage of the Ukrainians trying to enter the southern edge of the northern part of Vachansk. We got some footage of that the Ukrainians are in this area, and this basically complicates Russian connections from the aggregate plant to Russian positions in the north of Vachansk. So the Ukrainians are putting up a fight. The Russians are fighting, the Ukrainians are fighting. Vachansk is a bloody fucking mess. So it's it's a back and forth. But in Kharkov in general, the Ukrainians sent their reserves here, and it's paying them dividends. But this costs them from being able to address other areas of their front, like in Toretsk, which might be the main reason why the Russians even activated on this front in the first place. So that's the end of this video. Hope you guys enjoyed. This was a lot of updates this week. I was expecting not a lot of updates, but we just got a bunch of updates dropped on us in the last 2-3 days. So a lot of interesting things. The Russians are attacking everywhere. And it's going to be interesting to see how the Russians develop in the month of July, because this is the last week of June. We're now getting into the dog days of summer. And we shall see how the Russians continue developing in their summer offensive. So that's the end of this video. Hope you guys enjoyed. Subscribe to my channel, give this video a thumbs up, comment your thoughts, and share this video around. So aim high and wander on.